Hi class, we are looking at chapter 3, prenatal development and birth. It's an interesting chapter. To me, it's a fascinating chapter, and the reason why is this is a time of your development that more development occurs in utero than ever afterwards, after birth. It's quite amazing. So the chapter 3 starts out with the course of prenatal development, and I'm looking at my notes here and there on my computer. So if you see me looking down, I want to make sure I cover the highlights of the chapter that I'd like you to focus on. There is, of course, 3 stages associated with the development of life. From a lifespan perspective, life begins in the germinal period. That is a period of prenatal development, the first 2 weeks after conception. And then we've got the embryonic period. That is from 2 to 8 weeks. That's when the child is called a zygote. It's given that name. And also then we end, of course, during the embryonic period we experience organogenesis, which is going to be really an interesting topic, especially when we look at teratogens. And then the fetal period is from 2 to 9 months of age. One thing I want to emphasize as I go through this, and I kind of will spend time talking about the germinal period with the class, going over just basically reading through what the text talks about as far as the development occurring. Of course, with the germinal period, the biggest thing is we have the development of the blastocyst and the trophoblast. The blastocyst is the inner mass of cells that develops into the embryo, and the trophoblast is the outer layer of cells, provides nutrition and support. And we've got the embryonic period. We've got the endoderm, ectoderm, mesoderm that are developing there. I won't spend time talking about it just because of the brevity of these videos. And the fetal period is where we see increases in physical development. The brain is so interesting at this time. At birth, an infant will have a brain that has 100 billion neurons. Now, if you recall, we talked about what neurons were earlier in the semester. But neurons are about 10,000 neurons can fit in a single grain of rice, and that's how small they are. They also travel at exceedingly fast speeds, about 250 miles per hour. 4 important phases of the brain development is the neural tube, neurogenesis, neural migration, and neural connectivity. So the neural tube is your spinal column. Neurogenesis is the development of neurons connecting together. And then there's neural migration, which is a period of time when they move to different parts of the brain, the hypothalamus, hippocampus, the pons, all the different components of the brain begin to develop. And then neural connectivity is where they form that connection that allows them to process information and to move my hands. This is from acetylcholine, a neurotransmitter that allows me to move my hands. This is what's occurring during this stage of development, this neural connectivity. Now, there are hazards to prenatal development, and I always emphasize this. Those are called teratogens. Comes from and let me go over my notes here real quick. Teratogen comes from the Greek word terra, meaning monster. There's 3 factors that are associated with it. That is dose, genetic susceptibility, and time of exposure. Let me just briefly kind of explain those. So dose, you can imagine if I'm exposed to an X-ray for 1 minute as opposed to 30 minutes, that would be the example of the dose. If you have a huge dose of something, then that's going to have a greater impact on you. Genetic susceptibility is our genes. Some people have genes that are more susceptible to teratogens than others. And then the time of exposure, and your text has got a nice picture of this organogenesis in this chapter that shows that development of the zygote into a full-term child. Some teratogens that I emphasize in class, I'm going to talk about one specific one that's not mentioned in your text, and that is thalidomide. Thalidomide is an interesting, it wasn't an interesting drug. It was over the counter in Europe. Here it was prescribed, but it was about the 1950s, late 1950s, early 1960s when it was prescribed to prevent women from experiencing nausea from morning sickness. The thing is with thalidomide is that it caused huge birth defects. What would happen is that it was bilateral, so it would affect both the right side and the left side at the same time. An example of that would be if I took the thalidomide on the 26th day of my pregnancy, I might be born without arms completely. If I took it on the 28th day of pregnancy, I might be born with just half of an arm. And so it was very specific as far as its effects on the developing fetus. And so it's so interesting, but they don't really mention it in the text here, which is a shame, because it really had a huge effect on it. In fact, there's a support unit, or support organization, for some reason in Canada. Let's see. They talked about the different ones: cocaine and caffeine, incompatible blood types. Again, I'm not going to emphasize it too much, just for the brevity's sake of this video clip, but you'll read through them as we go through this. Just looking at my notes here real quick, guys, seeing where we're going to go to next. One thing I do want to mention is maternal diseases. And one thing that was interesting is rubella. You know, recently we've heard about rubella outbreaks that are occurring primarily in California so far, although it's not exclusively California. I think of one incident that occurred a couple of years ago at, I think it was Disney World, or one of those Universal Parks, one of those places. And everybody was all shocked and worried about children developing rubella. But what nobody mentioned in the press, and to this, I haven't heard it yet in the press, is the concern associated with pregnant mothers who are exposed to a child who has an outbreak of rubella. In 1964 and 1965, there was a rubella outbreak in which 30,000, look at my notes here, 30,000 prenatal deaths occurred in America, and 200,000 negatively affected infants were born. I remember that because I had rubella during that time. And I remember walking to school, and it was like I had X-Men powers. As I was walking, my teachers were running away from me. Didn't know if they were pregnant or not pregnant, which is kind of a cool experience for me. But that was why it occurred. And so we don't really hear about it. We hear about rubella outbreaks and concerns about kids, but nobody ever talks about the concern to the developing fetus. Let's see. Just glance through my notes. Thanks for being so patient, guys. One thing the text talks about also is the emotional state of the mother and its effect on the child that's developing. It is so interesting to me because it's something I always ask for forensically when I do my evaluations on a child, and I want to know, well, what was the stress level? How much stress did you experience? Were you homeless when you were pregnant? Were you involved in domestic violence? All those can be factors that can affect how that child develops. Then there's also paternal factors that we don't talk about: diet, illicit drug use, smoking, and age. And age is kind of interesting. There's been some research to support that the age of the father may be a contributing factor to a spike that we're seeing in children with autism. It's not the research is not overwhelmingly convincing of that, but it sure is leading in that direction. And so, for the first time, we're thinking fathers might need to have some concern too about when they decide to have a child. Prenatal care, very successful here in America. It's been tremendously successful. In fact, they used to have a program, I don't know if they still do, in White River, where they would have, they would provide both the mother and the father cash incentives, as well as baby supplies and stuff like that. It was a program that started at Harvard. This is dating me a little bit back. It was back in the late 1990s, early 2000s. Not sure if that program is still out there, but was very, very helpful for parents. Birth process, 3 stages. First stage is where the cervix dilates to about 4 inches. Second stage usually lasts, and that can last from 12 to 24 hours. In the first pregnancy, later pregnancies, 8 hours. Second stage, about 1.5 hours. First pregnancy, later 45 minutes. It's where the baby's head moves through the cervix. And then the third stage is the afterbirth, where the placental umbilical cord are expelled. Membranes detach or expelled. Childbirth settings. For us in America, we primarily have our children in hospitals, overwhelmingly. Although midwifery can be a factor, doulas are becoming a new thing where they provide support for mothers during their pregnancy and as well as during the delivery. There's talk about methods of childbirth. One controversy is C-sections or natural vaginal births. It's been kind of interesting to see the rate of C-sections. They climb when there's little concern, but once mothers become concerned about C-sections, then we see them dipping. Then they go back up and go back down. It's pretty interesting to see that. Oh, and just one thing I always mention, I always think it's kind of ironic. Who do you think invented natural childbirth? I always don't start my class, but that's one of the questions I ask my students. And they're thinking, I don't know. And in fact, it was developed by a man. Don't take that the wrong way. It's developed in 1914 by Grantley Dick Reed. He's the one who takes credit for it. Ironically, a man takes credit for it. But in fact, what it really is it's kind of like an early edition of Lamaze. So he just kind of had some teaching involved with it, helping mothers deliver their child. Assessing the newborn, using APGAR scale, Brazelton scale, neonatal intensive scale that's used for children that are at risk, which brings us to preterm and low birth weight. I do want to mention that the most serious of all these, I mean, none of these are good. We want everybody to be, going through the process like they should, not coming out earlier. But of them, the one that's the most dangerous is small for date. And so this is an individual who may be premature, but when they're born, they're also small for date. That means compared to a child in utero, they weigh less than expected. That is the most dangerous of all. And they weigh less than 90% of all babies at the same gestational age. That's kind of the diagnosis associated with it. One study found that small for date infants had a 4-fold increased risk of death, so it's very challenging. They do talk about emotional psychological adjustments, postpartum depression, and they give us one paragraph for men. We used to have more, but that XY chromosome, we're genetically fragile, but people don't really give it too much concern. Women certainly go through the bulk of it, but they do say that many fathers feel that the baby comes first and gets all of the mother's attention. And usually at this time in class I'll go, "Oh," but I don't get a response back. So that's okay. It's just, I always like to bring it up because the paragraph gets smaller and smaller and smaller as the additions go on. Pretty soon they're just going to exclude the fathers from there. So with that said, guys, that finishes up chapter 3. I hope these videos are helpful for you. And we will see you in the next video. Thank you. Bye-bye.